The topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Alise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program, which has been brought to you with passion and pride since February of 2015. Thanks for tuning in this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. If we have not met before and you don't know me, I'm an organizational psychologist and logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Gusto Now help companies to enliven and fortify their operations by building a dynamic, high-performance culture and inspirational leadership activated by meaning and purpose. And did you know that inspired employees outperform their satisfied peers by a factor of 2.25 to 1? In other words, inspiration is good for the bottom line. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at gusto-now.com or my personal site, alisecortez.com. Getting into today's program, we have with us today Siobhan McHale, who helps people lead change, and her why today is better workforces, better workplaces. She has worked across 4 continents, helping thousands of leaders to create more agile and productive workplaces. She also has been on the inside as the executive in charge of culture change in a series of large multinational organizations. She is the author of The Hive Mind at Work, Harnessing the Power of Group Intelligence to Create Meaningful and Lasting Change, which we'll be talking about today. She joins us today from Melbourne, Australia, where I believe it's 10 a.m. Wednesday and it's 5 p.m. Tuesday for me. Siobhan, a hearty welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thank you very much, Alise, and good day from Melbourne, Australia.
It's wonderful. It's so wonderful to have you. I terribly enjoyed reading your beautiful book, and I really have a suspicion just how much work and effort this put in. All of your acknowledgments told me, of course, that you had a lot of support, but I really want to applaud you for creating such a beautiful, well-written book.
Well, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed it and that it's helpful.
I did. I gleaned a lot of things from it. And one of the things I want to open with, I think it's pretty fascinating. I love how you situate the whole book, of course, in the wisdom from bees. You got to think about bees. I got to think about owls. So could you talk about your fascination? Where did your fascination come from with bees, and kind of a little bit of how you're leaning on it, especially for the work of this book?
Sure, Alise. So I grew up in Ireland, and as a child, I was fascinated by the bees as they swarmed in the orchard of my family's farm. And this fascination with natural ecosystems actually led me to a career path studying human ecosystems. So I'm really fascinated by how groups operate, not just individuals. And this led me into a career path as I call an insider. But yeah, this fascination with the bees actually led me into a career in psychology, organizational psychology, and eventually to become an insider, the executive in charge of change in a series of multinational firms, as you mentioned.
I really appreciate and align, Siobhan, with this idea of really relying on and, shall we say, drawing from the wisdom of nature. So there's a lot we can talk about, and I know we'll be weaving some of your concepts that you got directly from really understanding bees as we go. And let's next take it then to, you have this idea here that you've developed and you draw from when you implement change and help others do the same, these 9 laws of group dynamics. I don't really know that we need to go through all 9 of them, but it would be nice maybe to help give a flavor to our listeners and viewers as to just maybe what a few of those laws might be and indicate just how they really are situated from the wisdom of bees.
Yes, well, at least most people, when they think about change, they've been given what I call an interpersonal toolkit. So they're looking at change from an individual perspective and how individuals behave. But we need to add to that picture with what I call a systemic lens, an understanding of how complex human ecosystems operate. And we can learn a lot from the bees in terms of how bees swarm and how bees operate when they undergo change. And from examining bees and examining human groups or human ecosystems over many decades, I formulated these 9 laws. And one of them, for example, is the law of role. So often we're taught that human behavior is governed by personality. And yes, personality has an impact on our behavior, but so does role, and the role that we take up in any group or in any system, if you like.
Beautiful. And then if you could speak to maybe embeddedness, I find that one really, really fascinating.
Yeah, the law of embeddedness is really about how sticky change can be, because when you do things for a long time in any group setting, it becomes embedded. And that is about how it's deeply wired into that organizational system or into that workforce to do things in a certain way. So in order to change, you've actually got to rewire that. We've got to physically, rewire how things are done. And that is often painful because it means rewiring the neural pathways in our brain. So you've got to understand how embedded the change is. And the more embedded it is, that behavior, the more difficult it will be to bring about change.
Oh, so beautifully explained. And then just finally, one more. How about pattern blindness?
Yeah, patterns are the hidden agreements between different parts of a group. And these hidden agreements often capture us. So we walk into any group and very quickly we are caught by the patterns in that group. So I often explain it in this way in a family situation. If you're in a new relationship and you bring your new partner into your family for the first time, they can often see things that you've become blind to.
Yes.
That's just the way things are done in our family. Isn't it the same in all families? Well, actually, no, it's not. But because we are part of that family, we become blind to that pattern. It becomes the norm. And the same things happen within the workplace. We are captured by these patterns. They become the norm. And we actually sometimes overlook the fact that they are maybe dysfunctional or no longer serving the organization optimally.
That's one of the many things that really struck me about your book, Siobhan, and certainly I could relate. I'm doing also helping organizations to transform culture, right? We're doing the same thing. We're helping to be able to hold the pattern above. These are the mirror above this. These are the patterns that are running your organization. As you would say, they oftentimes aren't aware of those. And so I thought there was so much that we could take from these different laws. And as we go along and talk about examples of different companies, I think it will really help our listeners and viewers really also start to get the ahas for themselves. So we'll carry on. Now what I'd love to do here, this is so interesting too, also as somebody who helps spirit change, not on the same level that you do, but I appreciated that you said that change failures usually stem from 2 conventional ways of thinking about transformation. Can you situate those 2 conventional, and then we'll talk about the way you do it?
Yeah, so the conventional ways of thinking about organizations are firstly that organizations are machines. And this really stems from, I suppose, Newtonian thinking in the 1600s, where we see organizations like clock-like mechanisms where you can pull a lever, oil a ratchet, drive change. All of these, even the language that we use would indicate that we see organizations often like machines. And in that machine metaphor, humans are mere cogs in the machine that can be manipulated. So that's one lens on organizations, and it impacts how we drive change and fix things. The second lens is that we see organizations more as social networks. And this emerged from the thinking of J.A. Barnes, who is an anthropologist studying a village in Norway. and he began to map the influencers in that village, and he described them as nodes in a network, and the people who had more influence had bigger connections, more connections. And we can see the influence of this very much an interpersonal lens. So in the social network, you needed EQ, or emotional intelligence, in order to have influence. And the influencers could help garner or create change. And that is another lens. But the third lens that I'm introducing is an ecosystem lens, which is that organizations or groups are ecosystems where each part of that ecosystem has a critical role to play. It's not about IQ in the machine. It's not about EQ in the social network. It's more about group intelligence in the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. So the first one, the 1600s, early, more logical, functional, rational, of course, being the IQ space, the social network being the EQ space, and then of course you were distinguishing yours as the GQ space, which I think is fascinating. And when we get into this next example about Coke, I don't know if you know this or not, but I don't even know if it's still around. But we had a very popular magazine here in the United States called GQ, and it was really, Do you know this? It was, it was about kind of sex appeal and such, and so it didn't speak to group intelligence, but it certainly would be an attractive sort of way to talk about, the idea of harnessing group intelligence through a GQ kind of lens for at least Americans as well.
Yeah, I've heard of that magazine, but it's not that.
Right. It kind of adds a nice little fun flavor to it, though, Siobhan.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, speaking of flavor, let's talk now. I was really compelled by all of your business examples that really showcase these kinds of different ideas and frameworks that you have developed, Siobhan. And so the idea when you were sharing in the book about how, I think it was Coke wanting to move into the UK with its, non-flavored or non-colored water or something like that. Can you share that case and just why that case study and why it went so awry?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the Hive Mind at Work is full of these sort of case studies, practical case studies, because I'm an insider. I'm less interested in theory and more interested in practicality and how can we really bring about change. And one of the case studies, some of them are from my own experience and some of them are from research on big companies where change failed miserably. And one of those was Coke, where it was introducing Dasani into the UK market with a view to expanding into 19 countries across Europe. But that failed miserably because of, initially it was because of what I call the order giver pattern. So there were order givers in the Atlanta head office of Coke that were giving the orders or the instructions to the order takers in the UK. And basically the pattern or the hidden agreement between the head office and the regions within Coke at this time was that you take orders from the order givers. So nobody questioned the orders and everybody just went along on the tried and tested method of introducing Dasani into a new territory and assuming that it would be successful. But actually, the case study goes into a lot of detail on this, but the UK consumers did not see Dasani in the same way as the US consumers. So context is everything, and seeing the pattern and not being run by that order taker pattern was the big lesson. But as change practitioners, it's really about not being caught by these patterns, Alise, really seeing the pattern and being able to rewire that pattern before it takes you down the wrong track. And in Coke's example, losing multi-millions of dollars on a failed product launch.
I want to sprinkle in a few more details that I think really bring this home for us, Siobhan, that I took from your book. I am a researcher, and I read my guest books cover to cover. As you can see from the notes that I sent you, that's how I prepare for the show. One of the things that struck me is that you also talked about how the Atlanta marketing team broke the law of multiple perspectives again when it used the same online ad campaign that it had run in the U.S. without testing the tagline "Water with spunk." Now, in the United States, spunk means something pretty playful and fun. But in the UK, you go on to say that spunk actually means semen, S-E-M-E-N. Quite a bit
Yes.
different meaning, right? And so you go on to say that, Coke must at some point have said to themselves, are you kidding me? How did we miss this? That's a pretty huge, glaring miss.
Yes, absolutely, Alise. That was a glaring miss. And when you think back to the root cause of that miss, you come back to the pattern. If you are an order taker in London and you're just being told what to do and you're just accepting the rules and the instructions from head office, you're not going to question that advice. You're not going to say, well, hang on, people here might think that spunk has a very different meaning. So that pattern was really one of the root causes of that failure, and failure to recognize a different context and to tap into multiple perspectives in different regions.
So beautifully explained, Siobhan. All right, let's take our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We're on the air with Siobhan McHale, who is an expert in helping people lead change. We've been talking about her beautiful book, The Hive. Sorry, I didn't write it down over here. I've got it. The Hive Mind at Work. I love the example of Coke. After the break, we're going to kick off that segment talking about the example of Pfizer. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, as I am dedicated to helping create a world where people realize their potential at work and are led by inspirational leaders that help them find their greatness. While we do business that betters the world, I continue to research and write my own books. So my last one came out in March of 2023. It's called The Great Revitalization: How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And I wrote it to help business leaders understand just how much the world has changed, what the workforce wants and needs from their work experience, and what you can do to supply that through 22 best practices in your culture. You can find my books on Amazon or my personal site, alisecortez.com. If you are just now joining us, my guest is Siobhan McHale. She's the author of The Hive Mind at Work, Harnessing the Power of Group Intelligence to Create Meaningful and Lasting Change. So next, I really have to showcase and celebrate, of course, the Pfizer example. I think many of us may have had some idea of some of the workings that really helped bring the COVID-19 vaccine to life, but the way you describe it, and this is just also just really, I have to celebrate the leadership behind this. So would you talk to us about that case study?
Yes, so another case study in the book is the Pfizer example, where Albert Bourla was appointed as the new CEO to Pfizer just before the outbreak of COVID. And rather than being caught by the system, as I talk about, he actually took a step back and he started to examine how is this ecosystem working. And what he discovered was that researchers and academics were all working, even the big pharma companies, all working in silos. And he started to see that he would have to break down that siloed pattern if he was going to accelerate the development of a vaccine for COVID. And the previous development of a vaccine for mumps had actually taken 4 years to develop. And Bourla knew that he couldn't afford to take 4 years to develop the COVID vaccine. So he introduced a 5-point manifesto. And one of those 5 points was the need for collaboration. And that started to rewire that siloed pattern, and people started sharing online, in online repositories. They started sharing news of their findings, of breakthroughs, of research. And because of that sharing and that collaboration, 9 months later, Pfizer was the first company to bring the COVID vaccine to market. So an incredibly visionary leader who saw the pattern that was running the system and who intervened in the system in order to bring about rapid change and a dismantling of that silo pattern. So a great demonstration, Alise, of what I call in the book group intelligence. And group intelligence is this ability to be able to understand complex, dynamic human ecosystems and to intervene in those ecosystems in a way that brings about successful change.
And just to bring home just really what a sheer monumental effort that really was, the numbers are pretty astounding. You say in your book that Albert Bourla had enabled that hive mind, but this is among 79,000 employees in Pfizer in more than 125 countries. And so, of course, embracing the idea of the intercompany corporation, liberated from bureaucracy and most of all, hard work to produce this honey of a success, as you say. I had so much fun with how you played with all the bee metaphor in your book. It was just fun. It was delightful.
Glad you enjoyed it, and we can learn a lot from the bees.
I know, clearly, your whole book is just delightful. Well, let's do this. Let's go ahead and introduce. You have a process to harness the power of group intelligence in your 4-step process that you call the Hive lens. Let's share that with our listeners and viewers.
Yes, so the book goes into a lot of detail on the Hive lens, and it really is, as I mentioned, Alise, moving from this interpersonal lens or this mechanistic lens that really has run change. If you think about change management, a lot of it has been about, you have your Excel spreadsheet and you project manage it, and you develop interpersonal skills using EQ, and your change will succeed. Well, actually, those are necessary but not sufficient in today's world where change is, escalating and ever more complex. You need this GQ lens, which is this group intelligence lens, and I give people a methodology in order to develop their GQ. The first one is really, and I call it the Hive lens. So the L in lens is about looking beyond. You've got to look beyond the presenting problems, which are often not your problems, and look for the underlying issues. In 95% of cases, the presenting issues during change or when you're trying to drive increased performance, they are not the actual issues that you're facing. So I give you tools to look beyond, to see the patterns that might be running your organization. The E in the lens is about experimenting, and I give lots of examples of how you can experiment. We're not living in a black and white linear world anymore. You've got to be able to set up experiments that can test your hypotheses and that can lead you ever closer to your success in terms of your delivery objectives or your change objectives. N is nudging. You've got to learn how to nudge for change, not drive for change. Ecosystems cannot be fixed. You cannot drive hard for change. That produces what I called unintended consequences. And lastly, learn how to strengthen the emerging change so that it becomes more embedded.
Beautiful. And to recap then, the lens model. So L for lens is look beyond, E is experiment, N is nudge, and S is strengthen. I think there's a lot of power in having just a very crisp sort of acronym like that. So it just works. In all of your whole, again, I know how hard you worked on this book because of the acknowledgments that you put forth, and I have some idea because of the books that I've written, but I really appreciate how well organized and tight it is, Siobhan. It's just beautiful.
Yes, thank you for that. And because I am an insider and a practitioner, I think, and the executive in charge of change, I realize that things have to be practical. I'm not an academic, and that lens is very valuable, but I come from that perspective of wanting to make theory, like you can have a theory, but when you're actually in the trenches working in an organization, sometimes the theory doesn't stack up. So you need practical tools, and you need simple, you need the complex made simple.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Absolutely. Well, and to that end, I have to say, once again, in your book, I was really riveted by how you explained the Lehman Brothers downfall so crisply. There's been a lot of conversation over the years about that big behemoth disaster, but I've seen very little commentary that so crisply explained just how it happened. Can you share your perspective on just how it is that Lehman came down?
Yeah, so that is another case study in the hive mind at work, and it's really another illustration. Often in these complex cases, we get lots of commentary, and there was a lot of commentary on how did this downfall happen, and some people would have blamed the CEO. Other people might have blamed the compensation or remuneration. Other people might have blamed the market conditions. So lots of analysts, lots of commentators dissecting that case study, but very few with what I call a systemic lens. And the systemic lens is really understanding how the whole ecosystem operates and the role that different parts were playing in co-creating that disaster. So I take that systemic lens and I look at each of the parts of that complex ecosystem and how they stepped into a different role. So investors, for example, stepped into role of demanders, demanding ever more higher returns from Lehman Brothers and other banks. The executive team and the board stepped into role of endorser of the executive remuneration that encouraged short-term thinking. The executive team itself stepped into the role of short-term thinkers. So they were really only thinking about the next year and the next year's profits. And then the accountants stepped into the role of window dressers, really just covering up for some of the misalignments and the practices that were not meeting the guidelines, the regulated guidelines. So together they were creating what I called the short-termism pattern. And this was really about the hidden agreement in the system that we chase short-term results to the detriment of longer-term considerations. And that pattern was just running Lehman Brothers and, in fact, probably many of the financial institutions at that time. So it was systemic. It was a hidden agreement in the system. And we need to see those hidden agreements in order to be able to successfully rewire them and bring about lasting, sustainable change.
We've had a couple of guests on this podcast over the years, Siobhan, talking about the problem of, running a business by the quarter system and how limited that really is. And of course, being somebody who champions purpose is playing the long game. So I really found that that pattern that you had explicated, the short-termism made a lot of sense to me, and all the roles that the different groups played. So beautifully explained. And then if we go on to the next one, we talk about what happened at Ford. One of the things that I think is really important about what you're going to share here is this is a problem that you're going to talk about that lives large in so many companies, as I know you know as well. And that's the idea of, the punisher mentality, punishing mistakes and punishing when people don't know things. And so if you could share that example of what was going on with Ford and how they were trying to test new patterns as well.
Yeah, so when Alan Mulally joined Ford in 2006, the organization was in deep trouble and was facing the worst profit results and the biggest profit loss in its over 100-year history. So Mulally was bringing his executive team together, and what he was noticing was that every update, when he brought them together on a weekly basis in his Thunderbird headquarters room, and every update that they were giving was a sea of green. He had developed this traffic light system where green was okay, on track, and amber and red. Many people would have seen this tracking mechanism, but he was just facing a sea of green every week after week. People saying it's green, it's green, it's green, it's everything's on track. And he called them on it, and he said, well, how can it all be green and we're making, we've just made the biggest loss in our history? I want to see more color, basically. I want to see more transparency. And the next meeting, one of his executive basically started to say there are problems with one of the products that was bringing to market. There are some problems in production. And you could have heard a pin drop when he admitted that. There was just silence in the room because people were used to very negative consequences if they had admitted failure or mistakes. But Mullally actually clapped and said, thank you for that transparency and for bringing that to light and for sharing that with us. And now we can all help work on a solution to that problem. And that was the beginning of a shift in what I call the punishment pattern at Ford, where managers had stepped into role of punishers and employees had stepped into role of fearful ones. And I talked earlier about the role that you take up. This is the systemic role that they were taking up. And the hidden agreement or the pattern between those parts is we punish those who make mistakes. And I call that the punishment pattern, with different parts stepping into different roles of fearful one if you're an employee and punisher if you're a manager. So mistakes were not tolerated whatsoever in Ford, but Mullally, a very insightful leader with group intelligence, could see this pattern and rewire that pattern. And that was the beginning of an incredible turnaround at Ford, which I go into in a lot more detail in the book. But that case study is another example of over 30 big patterns that are often invisible to us that I walk through in the Hive Mind at Work that can help leaders begin to see and rewire these often dysfunctional patterns.
Mm-hmm. And the reason that one really stuck out for me, Siobhan, is that, in my work, helping leaders to develop and transform their cultures and their leadership, oftentimes, because I'm the outsider, I can walk right in for the first time to an organization and I can smell the fear that lives in an organization, right? You're not gonna innovate. You're not gonna perform in an organization like that. And you're sure as heck not gonna speak up if you think something might be going awry here. And so I really felt like that was a really important case study to talk about because so many organizations fall prey to that unknowingly, unintentionally. And it's such an important problem to get to the bottom of and to start to free up and move or set free, if we will, to use more of your analogy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what the Hive lens, what I try and do in the Hive lens is move away from the blame around that, because often these patterns emerge for very good reason and they have helped us as an organization to survive and thrive in the past. So maybe at one stage, this focus on getting things right and perfection and making sure everything was done properly was actually serving the organization very well. But over time, it became dysfunctional and it ended up being the punishment pattern. Yeah. And because people become blind to this, you step into an organization and literally within weeks, you are captured by this pattern.
Yes.
This is the way things are done around here. This is the norm. This is what we do. And so often you can't even see it, which is the benefit that Mullally brought. He was fresh. He was new. He had a different perspective. Outsiders can bring that fresh perspective or that new lens to an organization and help you to see what you've become blind to, which is the great benefit, Alise, that you and other consultants and external advisors can bring to a company.
Indeed, especially when informed by some of your practices. That's part of the reason that I host the show, because I keep learning from amazing people like you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We've been on the air with Siobhan McHale, who's an expert in helping people lead change. We've been hearing about some of the beautiful case studies in your book that really showcase the value and practicality of her work. After the break, we're going to talk about a little bit about how leaders can become even more efficient in utilizing these kinds of practices, and also hear about what happened, what was underneath the NASA mega disaster. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. I mentioned in the last break that my book came out about a year ago, The Great Revitalization. What I did for you is I created a 3-page, very simple assessment that you can pull off my website. It will help you understand the extent to which your organization is meeting the discerning needs of today's workforce and where you're strong and where might you want to shore things up. You can find it at gusto-now.com. If you are just joining us, my guest is Siobhan McHale. She's the author of The Hive Mind at Work, Harnessing the Power of Group Intelligence to Create Meaningful and Lasting Change. So I have to tell you, I was completely blown away by how you described just what happened with the NASA mega disaster that I remember when that happened. I'll let you just paint the whole situation because you do it better than I do. But if you could, and then I'm going to sprinkle in the parts that I found particularly interesting and worth focusing on, for me anyway.
Yeah, so one of the things I talk about in the Hive Mind at Work, Alise, is the need for proper measurement during change.
Right.
Because often we forget where we started the journey. We forget the progress we've made along the way. But you need to measure and measure accurately. And one of the examples I give of where there wasn't this accurate measurement was the NASA story of their space Mars orbiter that actually it was a complete disaster and it missed Mars completely and is now lost in space, literally, because there were 2 teams working on this spacecraft and the mission, and one was the engineers based in Denver. They were using English measurements, so they were using, for example, feet and inches. And then the other team in California, in Pasadena, they were using metrics. So they were using centimeters and meter measurements. And they didn't ever align with each other. They didn't share that. They made some assumptions. And because of the fact that they were using 2 different measuring sticks, literally, this space orbiter missed its target and just never landed, and now literally was lost in space and disintegrated in orbit. And it was just such a classic example for me, because what I was looking for in writing the book, Alise, were these really practical examples which showcased the theories and brought them to life. All of these things that I know from being a change insider, being a practitioner, bringing about change over the last 2 decades as the executive in charge of change, is that you need practical measures. You need case studies that showcase when this does not happen and what are the consequences. And that was one of the ones that really stood out for me, which really illustrates the importance of measurement and making sure that you have accurate measurement in place right from the beginning of your change.
That would have to be another one of those examples where once they really understood what happened, it would have to be one of those, oh my gosh, how in the world could this be so, right? How could we have missed this? And yet it's so natural and normal. It's so human. You know, we run organizations by humans, and by our very nature, we're very messy. And so I want to extend so much empathy to that, because I have to imagine just how painful that realization must have been.
Absolutely. Always what I talk about during change is often we face in complex dynamic ecosystems, we face unintended consequences, which is why the machine metaphor of organizations doesn't work. Right. Organizations are not machines. They're not clock-like mechanisms. You cannot, we have this view that change, you go from A to B to C in a linear, logical fashion, but it's never that simple. And in fact, I talk about the analogy, it's more like a spider's web. an organization, and you look up and you see a thread of, there's low engagement over there. There's a thread of customer dissatisfaction over here. There's a thread of quality issues, and down below you might have fraud, a case of fraud within the organization. And which thread should you pull? The more you pull these threads, the more tangled up you seem to get. And it's really about seeing how that whole ecosystem is functioning and rewiring or repatterning that web in order to create more functional and more effective organizations.
Beautiful analogy. Well, we can't really let you go without talking a little bit more about really some of the role of leaders and how their successful and sustainable businesses step into you talk about 4 critical roles depending on the task and also the timeframes. So I think it's useful for you to share those 4 roles. And I also recognize that you say that, we don't just, play one of them. We need to decide when and how we're going to play all of them. What are they, the 4?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things in the book is talking about role and reframing your role depending on the circumstance. And often we think of our behavior as being set by our personality, but actually our mental map of our role governs our behavior in a very powerful way. So I give leaders a framework for that, and I talk about 4 big roles that we take up. The first one is delivery leader. You've got to deliver on your imperatives in the business in order to gain credibility. You've got to deliver on your promises, and usually those promises are to your customer in the first instance, but that is a really important delivery lead role that each of us play as leaders. The second is a business strategist. It's not enough just to keep on running your business. You've got to have a clear strategy about where you want to take your part of the business. Then there's a performance coach, so really focusing on how you can help your people to deliver on what their imperatives are. And then the last one is a change leader, and often this is one that we forget. And you've got to play your part in change. And sometimes leaders forget that, and they delegate change to the experts. So they're the IT experts, or they're the digital experts, or they're the experts on employee engagement. So it's their problem. But actually, as a leader, you must always see and take up your unique change role.
I think that's really incredibly useful, again, to be so specific. I think anybody who just heard you say that can get their head behind, I can see myself assuming that role. I know when I need to step into that role. Just so useful. Now, the next thing that really blew me away, I have to say that I was rather gobsmacked by this. You go on to say in the book that this is about reaching critical mass. You say seasoned change leaders know that you must arrive at the key tipping point within 18 months of embarking on change or risk confirming the group's cynicism. That's fascinating. That's an interesting number. I don't think I knew that number before.
Yes, well, I learned this when I was the head of change at the ANZ Bank, one of the major banks in Australia. And we had been embarking of a transformation of the bank, which was the lowest performing bank in the country and had the worst customer satisfaction. And the CEO was liaising with other CEOs of banks across the country. And he had agreed with them that they would stop closing rural branches in the country because they were really needed by people in rural areas. But one of the other CEOs broke rank and decided, no, we're going to shut down 54 rural branches. We don't need them. They're not making enough money. And that same day, the CEO of ANZ, John McFarlane, announced to the marketplace that he would buy those 54 branches.
Wow.
Now, that never actually eventuated because there were a whole lot of regulations. But just him doing that, saying, listen, this isn't good enough. I'm going to stop this. I'm going to buy those branches because the public is sick and tired of banks behaving badly and our employees are also disengaged. That one act of saying, I'm going to buy those branches actually caused a tipping point in the change that he was trying to introduce, which was this much more customer and employee-centric organization. So people began to move from cynicism to thinking, well, this is a person that maybe I can believe in. This is a change that perhaps is worth investing in. This is a journey that perhaps I can join, and I can be purpose-driven in that. And overnight, almost, that reached a tipping point. And you can see this, and leaders with group intelligence, I explain in the book, have a way of understanding how to intervene in complex human ecosystems in order to reach these tipping points faster and not get what I call unintended consequences. So I talk a lot about how you do that, reach those tipping points like John McFarlane did at the ANZ Bank.
It's incredibly alluring. I do want to read this other passage that I think also really supports what you were saying here. You say leaders who grasp the power of group intelligence focus less on the mechanics and more on the vision to reach the tipping point sooner. They focus on how accomplishing the change will make people feel rather than the step-by-step process that will get them there. Their storytelling toolbox usually includes powerful symbols that capture the imagination and help trigger the tipping point. From the work that I do, of course, that's essential parts of what we teach as well. I just thought that was really powerful, that you really focused on the vision, how people feel, and of course the symbols. And then you also go on to say that smart leaders know how to nudge a group toward these critical junctures by deploying stories, symbols, and rituals that facilitate a viral change. Leaders with group intelligence intervene in complex ecosystems to move the group from chaotic calling individuals to a collaborative force for change. All of that is just really speaks to me of really, I would say, very highly nuanced leadership and communication and group intelligence skills.
Yes, and I think this is right, Alise, because people have been given EQ skills, and EQ is fantastic in terms of interpersonal skills. It allows you to understand your own emotions and to understand the emotions of other people. But that, as I say, is necessary, but not sufficient in dealing with complex human ecosystems or groups or organizations. You've got to develop GQ. Yes. And GQ is the ability to understand how these complex ecosystems are functioning and to be able to intervene in those complex human ecosystems in order to help them to deliver, to grow, or to adapt. And those intervention points are critical. And we're not taught how to do that. Nobody is teaching us yet about group intelligence. When you talk about it, it seems so sensible and so logical, but yet we're not taught. We're taught EQ, but we're not yet taught GQ, which is this much more systemic way of intervening.
Why we need you. We really just touched on just a few of the many points we could have spoken about in this book. There's so many other things, and I just pulled out the things that really kind of resonated with me. I think you might know that this show is listened to by people around the world who are trying to either create a better workplace for themselves, become better, more inspirational leaders, and ideally help their organization do business in a way that betters the world. What would you like to leave them with?
Yeah, I would like to leave them with the thought that IQ and EQ are no longer sufficient for the complexity we're facing today, and change has become a tsunami. And really to step into their role, to start to equip themselves with group intelligence or GQ, and to start applying a more systemic lens to our workplaces. And hopefully the Hive Mind at Work can start you on that journey. It does require a rewiring of your brain, and it is I've been on this journey for over 2 decades now. It is a learning process, but it is possible to develop your group intelligence, and definitely a worthwhile journey.
I think your book has taught us a lot, and so is this conversation. Very happy to know you, Siobhan. Very grateful to have learned from you, getting to share you with my listeners and viewers around the world. Thank you for being on Working on Purpose.
Thank you so much, Alise, for all the work you do and the difference you're making.
Thank you. Listeners and viewers, you are going to want to learn more about Siobhan McHale, the work that she does helping people to lead change, and her book, The Hive Mind at Work. Best place to do that is on LinkedIn. You can find her there. Let me spell her name for you. Siobhan is actually spelled Siobhan. And last name is McHale, Mchale. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch every recorded podcast. We were on the air with Carla McLaren talking about her empathic approach to emotions, reevaluating them even for the most negative emotions that open startling new pathways into self-awareness, effective communication, and healthy empathy. We learned about the wisdom in anger, for example, anxiety, and even shame, among so many other pearls of unusual wisdom. Next week, we'll be on the air with Janet Aioli talking about her work helping leaders to create their most powerful, impactful presence. See you there. Remember that work is one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.